On the eastern edge of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, tucked among the mountains of North Carolina, is a place called Cataloochee. A windy, bumpy drive from I-40, nearby Maggie Valley and Waynesville, or from the Big Creek area, this is one of the more hidden gems that the park has to offer, and well worth the extra effort required to get there. Just think of the narrow, partially gravel mountain road that leads to Cataloochee as part of the adventure, and also part of what makes this one of the quieter, more remote areas of the park. But with its quaint historic structures and exciting wildlife viewing opportunities, this small valley has become a favorite spot for many Smokies visitors. The Cherokee called this place Gadalootsee, which means standing up in a row, possibly a reference to the mountain peaks that surround the valley or to the trees that line those ridges. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Cherokee were the first to come to the valley, where they hunted and fished but apparently did not settle here. White settlers came to the valley in the 1800s, and by 1910, there were more than 1,200 people living in the Big and Little Cataloochee areas. Hattie Caldwell Davis was born in Cataloochee and has written books about this special place. Her great-grandfather was one of the original white settlers to the valley.
My great-granddaddy went in there in 1834, and there was not a road. In previous times, the Cherokee Indian and the Eastern Buffalo had made trails, and that's what now is most of the trail of the road mostly follows that. These first two men that went in there was my great-granddaddy, Levi Belize Caldwell, and his friend was a herb doctor, and his older man, and his name was Young Bennett. And I think Young Bennett had a wife and 3 or 4 children, but when they got in there, it was just a wilderness. They said it looked like a great cathedral. The trees were so big and the limbs were spread way wide, and ferns was waist high, and they're still big, beautiful ferns. And the creek was so full of fish they couldn't hardly swim. Nobody had ever lived there. They would take cattle in from all over Haywood County and maybe other places and put them on the pasture. People say, why in the world did they come way back here? And at that time, there were mountaintops had grassy bald, B-A-L-D-S, bald, what looked like bluegrass. So they had free pasture, and then the hogs could get all the fine American chestnuts. Closest neighbors that my grandparents and the Bennetts had was 6 miles away, and that was the Cherokee. And they had their trail that came through Big Cataloochee, and they'd sometimes go up across Mount Sterling, would stop and spend the night. They wanted to sleep on the porch. They'd give them food if they had it, you know. And there was never any trouble with Cherokees. Got along wonderful with them. In fact, 3 generations before me spoke Cherokee. Of course, they all farmed, and they was lucky if they had cattle to raise and hogs and sheep. They grew flax and wove it and made their clothes. And they dyed it with indigo. And they could make them black by using it real strong or different shades of blue. They used marigolds and things to get yellow colored.
Hattie's grandfather's home, the Hiram Caldwell House, has become an enduring icon of Cataloochee. Hiram's son, Eldridge, Hattie's father, was 5 years old when the family moved into the house where he would eventually start his own family. Hattie was born in the Hiram Caldwell House in 1927 and lived there for the first 6.5 years of her life.
See, at first they had little bitty log cabins. I think 24 by 16 foot is about the only size 2 men could build. Granddaddy and Bennett had built theirs. And then others started coming in, and they got enough help they could build 2-story log houses. They had plenty of logs. In 1882, they pulled an old water-powered sawmill in there, and that's how they built this house. And all my granddaddy's brothers had nice big homes like that. But when they brought that sawmill in across the mountain as a portable, and I don't know if they pulled it with horses or if they got it on a wagon and brought it, but anyhow, they could put it by the creek and get the water, and it's water powered. And then they'd saw the lumber there and stack it, and when it dried, then they'd start building. The reason it took 5 years, first of all, it was a saw and a hammer and nails. They had no electric stuff, you know, like today they zap it on. They built it well, they took their time, and then when it came time to put the crops in, they had to go back and plant their crops and take care of that. And when it slowed down, they'd come back again and work. And then my granddaddy was hauling the ceiling in there. I guess it must have taken some time to do that because they matched all the patterns so well. I said to Daddy, well, why would it stand up so long? He said, well, we didn't use anything but #1 lumber. And I said, what's #1? He said, not a knot hole. Anything had knot holes was used for kindling. And so that's why it's so solid, and then had the good ventilation because it's sitting up on rock, and I think it's locust posts on top of the rocks then to hold it up. It's a wonderful place to play because you had the round porch way on the side and all. It's a good old house. It's stood all these years, and the steps are almost worn on the edges, but they will not squeak. And all that beaded ceiling is still in place. Those men were not carpenters, they were craftsmen.
Eldridge Caldwell constructed the barn across the road from the house, using logs from his grandfather Levi Caldwell's old cabin. A variety of other buildings were on the property as well: a cattle barn, sheep house, tool shed, chicken house, and smokehouse. Hattie has good memories of helping with the chores as a child.
My grandma made the last soap you asked about. She'd stir it with a stick, and sometimes it'd be sassafras, and it'd make the soap smell so good. And she'd let me stir it a little bit. I was about 6 years old. And then she'd pour it up in a big box, and when it was cold to cut it, she'd let me cut it any shape I wanted. She was always picking geese and chickens for the feather beds, because we had feather beds, feather pillows, wool blankets. We had plenty to keep warm. But they had this chicken lot, and it was fenced and then overhead so they couldn't fly out. And she'd get in there and catch one, and she'd let me pull them little feathers. So I've learned to do about everything that I was big enough to. I churned plenty of times. And people say, what's that other little house down there away from that house? I said, that's the early refrigerator. I said, that's where we kept the milk and any leftover food, and that's where the milk was skimmed off and made the churning in a big crock jar. It had a cement trough, and it was only about 3 inches deep here, and that's where you could set small things. And then it was like this, and you could set buckets of milk. And I remember all this kind of large buckets we had. That went down one side, and the other side was a shelf all the way down. And they'd take the cream up and get the cream off into the churn jar. And they would leave it there till they got enough to churn. And it was brought to the back porch, and you do all this churning. We carried our lunch to school. Some had little lunch boxes, and some had bags. And a good many of them brought cornbread and milk, and they put it in a creek to keep it cold. And of course, all of them liked it. But then they'd trade with people that had brought biscuits with ham, jelly, and jam, cake or stuff. They traded with each other. Anyhow, I remember carrying our lunch and swapping and trading for different things and sitting under a tree at lunchtime. If it started to rain, boy, they got out in a hurry to get their dinner before the creek washed it away. Of course, the Farmer's Chapel, it didn't have the bell tower. They didn't have the money, you know, and when the park paid $1,100 for an acre and a quarter in the church, then they built the tower, and they had permission to always come back for worship service and reunion. It had a big pot-bellied stove in it, and I remember it from going to church. And they had lamps on the walls with reflectors, and this is for night service, and then they had a great tall lamp for the pulpit. They dressed up on Sunday. On Saturday, they were getting all fixed. Their shoes had to be polished and shined, their clothes ironed and spick and span. And this picture was made in 1912. and you could see the buggy, horse and buggy here, barely see it, and over here there's a horse. I think it's got a saddle on. That shows that they were not too backwoodsy. They dressed like that.
A drive through Cataloochee today offers a chance to see several historic structures, including the Caldwell House, Palmer Chapel, and Beech Grove School. Auto tour booklets are available near the Backcountry Permit Station. For those looking for a nice walk, a 2-mile round-trip walk to the Woody House is an easy trip, almost flat with a few creek crossings on footlogs. It is found on Rough Fork Trail at the end of Cataloochee Road. Old-growth trees, long-gone home sites, stone walls, and scenic streams can be enjoyed along many of the hiking and horse trails in the Cataloochee area. A hike into Little Cataloochee is a chance to see more historic structures, like Little Cataloochee Church, constructed in 1889. Today, the fields and forests of Cataloochee are home to the park's elk herd, animals that were at one time hunted out of the Smokies, but have been reintroduced by the Park Service. The best time to see them is in the early morning or in the evening. September and early October bring the rut, when males compete for females and the sounds of elk bugling resonate through the valley. Enjoy these majestic creatures from a distance with binoculars or a zoom lens. The industrious people of Cataloochee cleared and worked their land for 100 years, making productive farms from the wilderness and supporting their families. Now those who visit here experience only a remnant of what this mountain community and its fine people were like.
Everybody goes, said they love it, and they said they feel something. Those were good people. When they left their spirit. They died, but their spirit's still there.
My name's Driver Pheasant. I'm a Cherokee Indian with the Eastern Band of Cherokees. This is what the old men told me when I was a boy. A long time ago, all the animals lived up in Galun Ladi, which is heaven. And it was getting much crowded, and they were wanting more room. As they looked down, they saw the soft, flat earth, and they wondered what was down there, so they sent out different types of birds. Then one day, Shuli Egwa, he's the great buzzard, the grandfather of all the buzzards that we see now. He said he would go. He flew all around the world. After a while, he became tired, and he flew low down close to the earth. When his wings came down, they formed a valley. And when his wings came up, there was a mountain formed. And to this day, Cherokee country remains full of mountains.
The people followed trails of the buffalo and deer. They fished the streams and ate wild berries and established small villages. The old Cherokees called Cataloochee Gadalootsee, which means standing in rows or ranks and referred to the trees along the mountain ridges. But in the late 18th century, the ways of the Cherokees changed completely and permanently as white settlers pushed ever westward. In the beginning, a few hunters, trappers, and fishermen built cabins in the area. Then Colonel Robert Love purchased the valley for $3,000 and granted homesteads to those who would settle the land. The development prospered, and the white settlers, stuttering over the Cherokee syllables, called it Cataloochee.
I grew up in the Cataloochee Valley. It's in the center of the world. The reason I know that, you have to look straight up to see the sun.
Each year, Cataloochee families reunite. They come together in laughter, in song, and in fellowship. They reminisce over pictures which evoke fond memories of an earlier time. Palmers, Woodies, Hannahs, Suttons, Messers, Nolans, and Caldwells. Families who put down roots in the rich bottomlands along Cataloochee Creek.
Well, my great-granddaddy purchased some land in there in 1830. Was one of the first settlers, Levi Caldwell, and his wife Mary Nayland. And they raised a family of 11 children. They come in there in 1835, 1836.
Small log homes dotted the slopes. The first built by Levi Caldwell in the mid-1830s. 60 years later, Hiram Caldwell replaced the log house with a modern weatherboard structure. In the 20th century, the home became a welcome haven for tourists and renters. George Palmer came to Cataloochee about 1840. His sons, Lafayette and Jesse, each built a classic dog trot house. The covered breezeway, or dog trot, ran between two log cabins, one of which was used for cooking and eating, the other for sitting and sleeping. The women peeled apples or potatoes in the cool breezeway on hot summer days. The family dogs also used the area to keep warm in winter and cool in summer, thus the name Dog Trot. George's grandson, Jarvis, was the last Palmer to occupy the house. He enlarged it, added 3 bunkhouses, and visitors paid to fish in the 3 miles of streams he stocked.
Flora Arlie Messer Morrow. I was born in Little Cataloochee, November the 5th, 1895. 10 sisters and 1 brother. My father and mother were working people. They liked to have things and do things. My father was jack of all trades. He made about every casket that Cataloochee needed.
Little Cataloochee was separated from Big Cataloochee by Nolan Mountain, but the two were joined by blood and marriage as young adults moved across the mountain to establish their own homes. By 1910, there were 1,251 people in both Cataloochees. Like most early settlers, they became nearly self-sufficient.
My mother made our clothes out of the men's old pants. This should take the legs and make the clothes. So this one is me and some of my pants. This is a brother. Mother made his clothes too. They're very obviously homemade. I'd like to tell you about the shoes. They were a high-top moccasin, I suppose you would call them, and my mother made them from my father's old felt hats. She made her own pattern, and they would last surprisingly a long time. We all took our first steps in the shoes like that, and then if someone older than us had another pair of shoes they had outgrown, then we got real shoes and not felt hat shoes.
The people of Cataloochee also grew their own crops for food and ranged cattle in the mountains.
Farming was done primitive. Of course, in my time, we had horses and turning plows. And, I was probably plowing when I was 13-year-old. They'd grow wheat. And, of course, they had their corn. Corn was a staple food for making meal and bread. Jesse Palmer built the mill about in the mid-1850s. Of course, everybody come to the mill on Saturday, you know. They brought their corn and Saturday was regular meal day. Of course, they ground any other time that they need to be.
Cataloochans kept up with current events through national newspapers received at the Nellie Post Office. The combination store and post office provided a necessary tie to the outside world. Gudger Palmer remembers.
Let me just tell you a little bit about the post office. My father was postmaster, and however, my mother tended to the store and to the post office most of the time. And she would go down about 8 o'clock and fix up the mail. The women just about ran things. They did an awful lot of work. Now, my mother never worked in the hayfield or the cornfield, but she did do some work in the garden. She cooked all the meals, and when there's any special thing doing, like when we was killing hogs, why, she worked at that. She made the beds, swept the floors, scoured the floors by hand.
We had a good time. We were raised up in a Christian home, but my father, he liked good, clean farm. We had bean stringings and corn shuckings, and we'd have corn shellings.
Girl, straight line. Your line is crooked.
Schools were built in both Little Cataloochee and Big Cataloochee.
Went to school up here at the school, which is still standing. When I started, we had 2 rooms, but when I wound up, we had this 1 room, 1 teacher.
Flora Messer-Morrow taught in Little Cataloochee for a salary of $50 a month.
I never had much trouble teaching. I had a lot of fun. We had the blackboard, mostly, and then I had the children to take their books home, and they had to recite and tell me all about that lesson the next morning at school.
Each grade, she'd call up the front, go over your lesson at the front. That group would go back, and the next grade come up.
Cold. C-O-L-D, cold. The word
And always on Friday, we had a spelling match. The whole school participated.
Right. Sun.
Sun. C-U-N, sun.
Sun.
Which kind of sun?
The sun's shining today.
Sun. S-U-N, sun.
Trap. She said C-U-N, didn't she? Go ahead, Apple. Fade.
School was in session for only 5 or 6 months each year,
Next, fade.
as the children were needed for harvesting and molasses
You didn't
making.
pronounce it. Fade.
Church services were held once a month when the circuit rider came. Sunday school was in session every week. And each fall, the sounds of preaching, prayer, and the songs of revival filled the Palmer Chapel.
And there was 2 things. There was always a must at our house. And that was when Amos and Andy come on, you had to be quiet. And on Sunday morning come, you had to go to church. You had to go to church. That was 2 things that was a must.
Church, family, and hard work. These were the foundations for building a prosperous community.
I'd have to say, by growing up in Cataloochee and being as independent as our families were in there, and the rugged life that we had to live and hard work that we had to do to make a living, probably helped me when I come out to be able to make a decent living without much education.
In the early 1930s, the citizens of North Carolina and Tennessee entrusted this valley and its history to be preserved for future generations. As the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was created, families moved away, leaving behind vacant buildings and land no longer grazed nor plowed. But as we reflect on those who came before, sights and sounds of an earlier time echo through this valley. The Cherokee, the settlers, those who entrusted their hopes, their dreams, and often their lives to this place. They have not left us an empty valley, but one filled with vivid reminders of a heritage now bonded to the future.
P-E-R,
We would like to remind everyone to please be respectful to those around you. Be respectful to the park, the national park here, and please follow the sign and stay 50 yards away from the elk like it says. Do not go any closer than 50 yards. We appreciate you obeying the rules and staying safe. Thank you very much, and enjoy and have fun.